May the name of the Lord be glorified. As said, my name is Thomson George. I'm coming to the United States for the third time in connection with my academic program. The Lord has graced me to complete my doctorate, which I started in 2019, and it was a hybrid program. And that hybrid program, the Lord gave me the grace to finish it by 2025. And December 3rd was my final interview, and I had done my defense. Now I am only away for my graduation certificate, which God willing I get by the coming May 8th and 9th, where the function is there. So request your sincere prayers for my complete journey of my doctoral program. Now, about me, the Lord has graced me to be with a family in the United Arab Emirates. UAE has been the place where I grew up. But primarily, I'm an Indian by birth, born and raised up only in UAE. And I'm from Pathanamthitta, Kumbara Plavelil. We are called the Airi Kuriel. Forgive me for the Malayalam, because I'm only grade 3 in Malayalam. And the rest of that, it's by mandatory. പപ്പയ്ക്ക് നിർബന്ധമായിരുന്നു മലയാളം അറിഞ്ഞിരിക്കണം. അതിൻ്റെ നിർബന്ധത്തിൽ പപ്പ പഠിപ്പിച്ച ഒരു ഇതിൽ മാത്രമാണ് മലയാളം അത്ര ചുരുങ്ങിയ വാക്കുകൾ എനിക്ക് പറയാൻ പറ്റുന്നത്. And last week, I was able to worship with the saints in Carrollwood Bible Chapel in Tampa. This week, I'm happy to announce also that I will be participating with all of you in worship in the Lord's table tomorrow. For our short time of meditation, shall we turn our attention to the book of Genesis chapter 12, verse 10 to 20. ഉൽപ്പത്തി പുസ്തകം 12-ാം അധ്യായത്തിൻ്റെ 10 തൊട്ട് 20 വരെയുള്ള വാക്യങ്ങളാണ് ഇന്ന് രാത്രിയിലത്തെ വചനധ്യാനത്തിന് ഞാൻ എടുക്കാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നത്. Then we start with verse 10 like this. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for famine was severe in the land. നമ്മൾ അബ്രാമിനെ കുറിച്ച് പഠിക്കുമ്പോൾ we understand the significance of what this man's journey is, starting from the place where Lord is taking him to Canaan. And more than that, he is reminding the man of faith, വിശ്വാസത്തിൻ്റെ പിതാവായി നിൽക്കുന്ന ഈ വ്യക്തി ഏത് പ്രകാരം യാത്ര തുടങ്ങുന്നോ അതിൽ നിന്ന് ദൈവം എങ്ങനെ ഈ വ്യക്തിയെ കൊണ്ടുവന്നു, വാഗ്ദത്തം കൊടുത്താണ് കൊണ്ടുവന്നത്. And when we come to chapter 12, ഇവിടെ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത് തുടക്കം എങ്ങനെയാണ്? ഗോ ഫോർത്ത് ഫ്രം യുവർ കൺട്രി ആൻഡ് താഴോട്ട് വാഗ്ദത്തത്തെക്കുറിച്ചാണ് പറയുന്നത്. ഇറ്റ്സ് എ പ്രോമിസ് വി റീഡ് ദാറ്റ്, ആൻഡ് ഗോഡ് ഈസ് കമ്മിറ്റിംഗ് എബ്രഹാം ദാറ്റ് ഹി വിൽ ബി ദ ഫാദർ ഓഫ് മെനി നേഷൻസ് ഓവർ ദാറ്റ്. ബട്ട് ആസ് വി കം ഡൗൺ ടു ദിസ് ചാപ്റ്റർ, the challenge in this man's life is how he makes an impulsive decision. പെട്ടെന്നെടുത്ത ഒരു തീരുമാനത്തിൻ്റെ മുഖാന്തരം വരുന്ന പരാജയങ്ങളാണ് ഈ വിശ്വാസത്തിൻ്റെ പിതാവായിരിക്കുന്ന അബ്രാമിൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്. So that's where I bring you the subject this particular evening. കൈപ്പുള്ള ഒരു ജീവിതത്തിൽ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എബ്രാമിൻ്റെ കൈപ്പുള്ള ജീവിതം മിസ്രൈമിൽ വന്നപ്പോൾ ഏത് പ്രകാരമാണ്, how did he handle his choices? When he went through a bitter experience moving from the promised land to Egypt, how did Abraham handle his choices over there? നമ്മളേവരും പരദേശികളാണ്. We have come all the way from India to make a living. Some of us have grown up in this country. Some of us have been migrants in our journeys over there. But even in this journey of faith, we are all looking forward for our citizenship in heaven. നമ്മൾ കാത്തിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യമാണ്, we are expecting for that one day, one time, the Lord will bring us to that promised place over there. In that journey, how do we handle our choices? How do we avoid mistakes? അതാണ് നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത് ഇന്ന് രാത്രി. Some few lessons what the Lord has given me grace to observe from this passage over there. നമുക്ക് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ സാധിക്കുന്നത് how he is moving away from the promised land. Let me turn your attention to chapter 12 verse 5. Abraham took his wife Sarai and Lot his nephew, all their possessions which they had accumulated, which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. From chapter 12 verse 1 to 3, the promise is there. The Lord has graced Abraham. It is beautiful. And they reached Canaan. But when we come down to chapter 12, verse 10, there we see there is a famine. ഒരു ക്ഷാമമുള്ളപ്പം അവിടെ what is happening in the life of Abraham is that he is not seeking the permission of God. He makes an impulsive decision. He makes a choice in his life where he has to face the consequence of it. ഈ ചോയ്സ് എടുത്തപ്പം what is happening is he does not check the place where he went. അവൻ പോയ ആ ദേശത്തെക്കുറിച്ച് ചിന്തിക്കാതെ അവിടുത്തെ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് എന്തൊക്കെ വരും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അത് ദൈവഹിതമാണോ എന്ന് അറിയാതെ അബ്രാമിൻ്റെ യാത്ര തുടങ്ങിയപ്പോൾ അത് നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത് ആത്മീയമായുള്ള ഒരു യാത്രയ്ക്ക് പകരം ഭൗമികമായി തിരഞ്ഞു പോയ ഒരു വ്യക്തിക്ക് വരുന്ന ചില അന്ധകാരത്തിൽ ജീവിച്ചു പോകുന്ന ഒരു പരാജയങ്ങളാണ്. നമ്മുടെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ കുറച്ച് ഷോർട്ട് കമ്മിങ്സ് വരും, നമ്മുടെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ പരാജയങ്ങളുണ്ട്, നമുക്കറിയാം where we are failing, but the Lord is teaching us, let us not end up in bitterness. ആ കയ്പുള്ള നേരത്ത് മാത്രം ജീവിക്കാതെ യഹോവയുടെ കൂടെ ഈ യാത്ര പോകുമ്പോൾ how it is the promise God is giving us to take steps forward. And that's where we see when we look into Egypt is presented as a picture of the world. ലൗകികമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ചിത്രമാണ് മിസ്രൈം ദേശത്തെ കാണിക്കുന്നത്. And there it is a fleshly attention to enjoy the desire even in a time of darkness, how it can be promising over there. Now definitely there is nothing wrong to move into when there is famine, but let me remind you, take the permission of God. യഹോവയുടെ പെർമിഷൻ ഇല്ലാതെ യാത്ര ചെയ്യുന്ന അബ്രാമിൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ വരുന്ന പ്രയാസങ്ങളാണ് നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്. പാപത്തിലുള്ള ഒരു ജീവിതത്തിലേക്ക് തിരിച്ചു പോകുന്ന അവിടെയാണ് നമ്മൾ ആദ്യത്തെ പാഠം പഠിക്കുന്നത്. He was moving away from the will of God. He was moving. The paths to Egypt, there we see from the life of Abraham how it led him away. Verse 10, he made a choice and there he took a step over there without God. അങ്ങനെ യാത്ര തുടങ്ങിയപ്പോഴാണ് there we understand from the place of rest, from the place of God's guidance, he is moving into a place where God is not providing rest. There we see Egyptians are going to be very much disturbed, and how that plain or that entire portion we read there, Egyptians are also suffering when this person Abram is there. So may I draw your attention from verse 10 over there, the land of Canaan, which represented the best portion for Abraham. That is where God placed him, but Abraham's decision changed over there, and that's where the entire journey of pain and problem starts over there. And here we understand it was not the will of God. And it was not God's decision in Abraham's life. And that decision making, Abraham did not seek God. Abraham യഹോവയുടെ കാര്യത്തിന് വേണ്ടി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ യഹോവയുടെ ആലോചനയ്ക്ക് വേണ്ടി കാത്തിരിക്കാതെ ക്ഷാമം വന്നപ്പം സ്വയമേ എടുക്കുന്ന ചിന്തകളിൽ നിന്നാണ് അവിടുന്ന് മാറിപ്പോകുന്നത്. ഒരു കാര്യം ഇവിടെ നമുക്ക് ശ്രദ്ധിക്കേണ്ടതുണ്ട്. 8-ാം വാക്യം, 12-ാം അധ്യായത്തിൻ്റെ 8-ാം വാക്യത്തിൽ യഹോവയുടെ മുമ്പിൽ he builds an altar over there. അവിടെ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത് ഒരു ആരാധനയാണ്. And that's where we understand, even in the place of famine, even in the place of darkness, even if we are suffering over there, if God has appointed us over there, that means there is God's presence there. And there is an altar. We are ready to seek God, means there will God be present for us. But when he moves to Egypt, he does not build an altar. He does not have an option until he is escorted. And the last verse says over there, verse 20, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away. Please don't think that it is an honorable escort. He was asked to, Abram, get out of Egypt. ആ സ്ഥലത്ത് നിന്ന് പോവാതെ അവൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ പിന്നെ ഒരു ആരാധനയും ഇല്ലാതെ വന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. There we see in 13 verse 4, and that's where when he came to the place of the altar which he had made formerly, there he worshipped God. So one lesson which we as migrants or we as believers we need to pay attention is when we move away from the will of God, Number one, we are not under God's decision. Secondly, we lose the place of worship. And when we lose that place of worship, what happens is our choices, our thoughts, our understandings will be influenced by the people around us. അതാണ് നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്. What will happen in the land of Egypt when Abraham did not have worship, when Abraham did not have God's guidance, he is making choices wrongly over there. Let us turn our attention to chapter 12 and verse 11 over there. It came about when he came near to Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, "See now that I know that you are a beautiful woman." Now, what a great husband. He compliments his wife. ഭാര്യ നോക്കി, നീ സുന്ദരിയാണ്. And I think every wife will be pleasant to hear it. But there is a challenge is, what does Abraham say after that? That problem, it is good to compliment, but let me remind you, husbands, and I'm putting myself on the stand over there, we need to take care of our leadership in the house. And Abraham says something unfruitful, and that's where we see when the Egyptians say you, they will say this is his wife and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me, because of you that I may live on account of you. Now, what's happening in this passage? That passage reminds us the abdication of the leadership in the house. അബ്രാമിനെ ദൈവം ഗൃഹനാഥനായിട്ട് തിരഞ്ഞെടുത്ത ഒരു വ്യക്തി ആ വീട്ടിലത്തെ, he is losing control of his own house over there. He is saying to his wife, yes, she's the half sister of Abraham paternally when we explore the entire lineage. But the challenge here is he is talking to his own wife over there. And the partner or the spouse that God has added into his life, he is asking her to please protect me. എന്നെ രക്ഷിക്കാൻ നീ എൻ്റെ പെങ്ങളാന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ്, you are beautiful. And that's where we see the challenge in his life, where he loses control of that leadership God has given him. My dear brothers and sisters, what's the problem happens when we are not in the will of God. That's the problem happens when we move from Bethel, the house of worship, the altar. And that's where we recognize when he got influenced in the new place. പുതിയൊരു സ്ഥലത്ത് പോയപ്പം, പുതിയ ആൾക്കാരെ കണ്ടപ്പം, പുതിയ കൊട്ടാരങ്ങൾ കണ്ടപ്പം, he was influenced to see, oh, I am going to be insecure over here. I am going to be lacking safety over there. അയ്യോ, എനിക്ക് പേടിയായി തുടങ്ങി. He was moving in disobedience, and moreover, he was ready to compromise. ജീവിതത്തിൽ കോംപ്രമൈസ്, അവൻ എടുക്കുന്ന തീരുമാനത്തിൽ അബ്രഹാം is moving with a compromised attitude and how he can spare his life. Shall we introspect as we step into a new year before? Where are the areas have we moved away? നമ്മൾ മാറിപ്പോയിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ തിരിഞ്ഞു വരാൻ ദൈവം നമ്മളെ ഏവരെയും സഹായിക്കട്ടെ. അബ്രഹാമിൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ when he was moving away from the place which God appointed, it is where he does not able to seek God. ദൈവത്തെ തേടാതെ പോകുന്ന സമയം, ദൈവത്തെ തേടാതെ പോകുമ്പം there is no worship. And what happens eventually, he is compromising himself. His identity as a Christian, he is compromising. Then there we see bitterness happening. That കൈപ്പുള്ള സമയം വരുമ്പോഴാണ്, that's the journey which he starts, and then he moves forward. Now, ഒരു ഹ്യൂമറിന് വേണ്ടി ഞാൻ ഇങ്ങനെ എപ്പോഴും എൻ്റെ അമ്മച്ചിയെ ചിന്തിക്കാറുണ്ട്. Now, when I was small, I remember the bitterness of sweets, I call it. മുട്ടായിയുടെ കയ്പ്. I saw something on television, and I got a little bit angry with my parents, and I said, Mom and Dad, you are so and so. I don't want to say that language which I use. But Ammachi, Mone, ingotonnu vanne, please come here. She took me to the refrigerator and she reached out his hands from the top of the shelf. ഒരു സാധനം പൊട്ടിച്ചു. ഞാൻ വിചാരിച്ചു മുട്ടായാന്ന്. മോനെ ആ നാക്കൊന്ന് നീട്ടിക്കേ, and she rubbed it on my tongue. അന്നത്തെ ആ ബിറ്റർനെസ് ഞാൻ ഇന്നും മറക്കത്തില്ല. ആൻഡ് ഷീ റബ്ഡ്, ഇറ്റ് വാസ് മോർ ഓർ ലെസ് എ ചില്ലി വിച്ച് വാസ് വെരി സ്പൈസി. Now, അന്ന് എന്നെ ഓർമ്മിപ്പിച്ച ഒരു കാര്യമുണ്ട്. The bitterness of sweets, I call it. It is for my blessing later how I should not use foul language. Now, what I'm trying to bring your attention is, the bitterness sometimes is painful. Bitterness which we take our steps because we are frail. നമ്മുടെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ കുറവുകളുണ്ട്, ഷോർട്ട് കമ്മിങ്സ് are there. But are we going to sit behind and say, that's contentment? നമുക്കൊരു സംതൃപ്തിയാണെന്നോ, എനിക്ക് ഈ കുറവിനകത്ത് മാത്രം ഇരുന്നാൽ മതി, എൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ ഈ പരാജയങ്ങളുണ്ട്, ആൻഡ് ആസ് ആൻ അബ്രാം, ഞാൻ ഈ ഈജിപ്തിൽ പോയി എൻ്റെ സിസ്റ്ററാണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് അങ്ങനെ ആ ഒരു കള്ളത്തിൽ മാത്രം ജീവിക്കാൻ, that what God expects? That is where we need to start thinking and how we should make goals for this upcoming year of 2026. May the Lord help us to take steps forward. When we come back to chapter 12, verse 11 to 13, a man who does not seek God's will, a man who does not able to worship God, his choices in life, he started to plan for his safety. In chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, there God is very particular. Abraham, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you great. When God is providing security, in chapter 12, verse 11 to 13, he is looking at his own safety over there. And that challenge is where we understand he got influence. പുതിയൊരു ദേശത്ത് പോയപ്പോൾ he is looking at the Egyptians and he is thinking, these Egyptians would kill me. And eventually there is a compromise in his life. And that's where, when we come down from verse 14 onwards, where we see a mishap. ആ അബ്രാമിൻ്റെയും സാറായുടെയും ജീവിതത്തിൽ അവിടെ കടന്നു വരുന്ന ദുരന്തം, അതാണ് നമ്മൾ പഠിക്കുന്നത്. So what we learn here in application is, God is not pleased when we compromise. When we end up in lying, when we end up not able to function in truth, the consequence that follows our actions are going to be very heavy, that cannot be measured or that cannot be contained in a man's hands. നമ്മുടെ കയ്യിൽ ഒതുങ്ങിയിരിക്കാത്ത തരം അതിൻ്റെ ഫലവത്ത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അതിൻ്റെ ഭവിഷ്യത്ത്, it is going to be so heavy. That is where we see Abraham is failing over there. Secondly, the minute we move away from the place that God designed for us, അതായത് ദൈവം തെരഞ്ഞെടുത്ത സ്ഥലത്ത് നിന്ന് അബ്രാം തന്നെ തീരുമാനിച്ച് മാറിയപ്പോൾ, there is no blessing, it is only problems adding over there. ആ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് കൂടി വരുന്നതാണ് ജീവിതത്തിൽ കാണുന്നത്. ക്ഷാമം വന്നു, വയറ് നിറയ്ക്കാം, my stomach will be full. But following that, there we see Abraham is compromising the life of his beloved. Abraham is compromising even the influence of his brother's son. നമ്മൾ മനസ്സിലാക്കണം, ലോത്തിന്റെ ഡിസിഷൻ മേക്കിങ്ങിനെ പോലും അവിടെ അബ്രാമിൻ്റെ ആ തിരഞ്ഞെടുപ്പാണ് തെറ്റിച്ചു പോയത്. When we come to chapter 13 and Lot looks at Sodom and Gomorrah, let me remind you, without even a change of thought, he chooses, I am happy to be there. Because what did Abraham do? What did I learn from? Or whom did I learn from? My senior uncle over there. May I remind you, our decisions are valuable. We read about Othniel when we come to the book of Judges over there. Now, there is an important portion in that book where it says, who will come and conquer? Othniel, when he's asking, who does it come? His brother's son comes up over there. എങ്ങനെയാണ് ആ ഒരു വ്യക്തിക്ക് അത്ര ധൈര്യം കിട്ടിയെന്ന് നമ്മളൊന്ന് ആലോചിക്കണം. How did that person get that courage? Because he saw his uncle looking to God. So when our siblings, when our children, when our nephews, nieces looks at the bold utterance of our faith in God, may I remind you, you are a living testimony for them. We are migrants over here. We are workers over here. How do we stand with faith? How do we teach our siblings? How do we teach our cousins? My brother or my sister is far away. No. How my children listen to the stories. Even a cousin can be influenced over there. Please let me remind you, the Bible is not just an individual book, it is a family guidance book. ദൈവം ഒരു സഭയ്ക്കാണ് ദൈവത്തിൻ്റെ ഈ പുസ്തകം തന്നിരിക്കുന്നത്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഈ ദൈവശാസ്ത്രം പഠിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. സഭ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ വെറും ഒരു വ്യക്തിത്വത്തെ മാത്രമല്ല, അത് കുടുംബങ്ങളെയാണ് കാണിക്കുന്നത്. ആൻഡ് ദാറ്റ്സ് വേർ ദ ഫാമിലി നീഡ്സ് ടു ബി കമ്മ്യൂണിക്കേറ്റഡ് over here. And that's the lesson which we study here from chapter 12 verse 11 to 13. The compromise in one man's life, he compromises his beloved's life. He compromises his cousin's life. And that's where he was moving away from God's will over there. From 12 verse 14 to 15 and 16 to 20, there we see the consequences are happening. As Abraham predicted, Sarah is beautiful. And that's where the Egyptians saw that she was beautiful. Pharaoh's officials came her, praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. What a great tragedy. Now, sometimes I put myself in the shoes of Abraham at this moment. How happy, or how can I be happy when my wife is taken from my own house? എൻ്റെ വീട്ടിൽ നിന്ന് എൻ്റെ ഭാര്യയെ എടുത്തോണ്ട് അന്യ പുരുഷൻ്റെ വീട്ടിലേക്ക് കൊണ്ടുപോകുമ്പോൾ എനിക്കവിടെ സംതൃപ്തിയോടെ ഇരിക്കാൻ പറ്റുമോ? എനിക്കത് സുരക്ഷിതമായിട്ട് അവിടെ ഇരിക്കാൻ പറ്റുമോ? ദൈവം ചേർത്ത് വെച്ചതിനെ പിരിക്കാൻ പാടില്ലെന്ന് പ്രമാണം ഇരിക്കുമ്പോൾ how can a compromise happen? That is where we understand the consequence of an impulsive decision. May the Lord help us to recognize how a departure is happening. If there is a departure, let me remind you, there is also God waiting for a restoration. The Lord brings the restoration together. And what is happening is, when Abraham is saying, she is my sister, and she is why not she is my wife, she is trying to negotiate over there. Now, this is something which I started to think in my own personal life. Do I end up negotiating my own areas of principles, or am I making compromises over there? Now, what is happening? Let me try to elaborate here. What is the picture we need to remember in happening in Egypt? Misraim ദേശത്ത് എന്തുവാണ് ശരിക്കും സംഭവിക്കുന്നത്? When he is saying she is my sister, there is Abraham learning not to stand with clarity. ഒരു ഉറപ്പില്ലാത്തൊരു വ്യക്തിക്ക് വരുന്ന ഒരു പ്രയാസമാണ് the areas more and more trying to compromise and justifying and negotiating, eventually making it a bigger problem. And that's the lesson we understand. It is a poor spiritual vision where he is not able to handle his own house, and he is sending or making it problem for his own wife over there. Now, let me draw your attention to a few verses over here. The problem what Abraham struggled in his life, it is about a decision making. Let me turn your attention to Galatians 5 and verse 17. Apostle Paul helps us as a New Testament believer what we need to focus on as a believer of today, and how we can prepare ourselves fighting the evil against this world. Then we read the words of Apostle Paul to Galatian believers in 5 verse 17. For the flesh sets its desire against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, for these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. Now, what do we recognize from the words of Paul over here? That is, when you as a child of God, when you are promised with the blessings of God, what happens in your child of God's life? That is where the flesh starts to attract us. The flesh starts to show us what is promising in this world. And when that promise elaborates, we do not lean on to the Spirit of God. ദൈവത്തിൻ്റെ ആ പരിശുദ്ധാത്മാവിനെ നമ്മൾ ശ്രദ്ധിക്കാതെ പോകുന്ന ഒരു അവസരമാണ് ഗലാത്യ ലേഖനത്തിൽ കൃത്യമായിട്ട് അവിടെ കാണിക്കുന്നത്. We are not able to function. That's where the Lord is helping us this evening to remember how we can look back or turn our attention to the Spirit of God given in our life, that we may do the things that the Spirit pleases, not what we please. നമ്മുടെ ഇഷ്ടത്തിനല്ല, ദൈവത്തിൻ്റെ ഇഷ്ടത്തിന് നമുക്ക് മുമ്പോട്ട് കടന്നു പോകാം. So our sin and disobedience not only brings problems in our life, but it also hurts our beloved's life, our family's life. So may the Lord help us to remember where we have influences. So what happened till now? That is, Abraham moves away from the land of promise. He was not seeking God's will. He was away from the land which God appointed, moving to Egypt impulsively. He lost the area to worship. He put the life of his beloved wife in danger, and then he also made a bad choice, showing to the life of his own sibling son over there. And later we understand, even when the Pharaoh's officials saw her and the woman was taken into the Pharaoh's house, there we see a negotiation to sin, inclining, we read over there. Until then we understand how Abraham thought he was successful, but all of a sudden, when his own beloved is gone, what a tragedy. What a tragedy, and what is happening in the life of Abraham over there. But we need to see, what does verse 16 show us after when Sarai was taken. As a reward, he was gifted നല്ല ഗിഫ്റ്റ്സ് ആൻഡ് നല്ല സമ്മാനങ്ങൾ കൊടുത്താണ് അവിടെ സാറായെ അവിടെ കൊടുത്ത്. I mean, there was a transaction we read, and that's where we read, he treated Abraham well for her sake. Definitely, when we look into the world, the influences are so beautiful. Now, so beautiful, it is a great attraction. Now we have got good luxury vehicles. Now I'm not saying, don't misinterpret me. If you have a capacity to buy a good vehicle, please do. But the problem is, are we leading our lives behind brands, or are we taking our understanding for our utilization for our needs? I was in Kuwait for a short period of time in connection with ministry, and there was a parent who came ventilating out his own pain along with his family. Now, I do have taken the time to ask him, can I share it with others? He said it's fine. Now, he told me something which bothered me also in my own personal life. He elaborated his pain by saying, "Sir, my son says, Father, you do not care about me." And I say, why did your son say? My father, you do not buy me what I am asking. I said, sir, don't you provide? Sir, ningal kodukunnille nalla bhashanam, nalla food, nalla clothes. No, I gave him everything, but he still says. And after so much asking too many questions, he said, he is complaining about a mobile phone. I said, sir, avanu nalloru phone koduttille. He gave him an Android. And the son asks him, Dad, you do not care about me because you didn't buy me an iPhone. Now, that's the time when I realized that's a brand value also plays a crucial role in the lives of everyone over there, even as young as a young boy. Now, what I'm trying to bring your attention here is, how are we allowing the influence of the outside world? Now, in media and marketing, that was my bachelor degree, one thing which my teacher reminds me, when you create a brand, you need to understand how that brand is available for the time, for the space, and for the people. Now, it keeps changing every 7 days. So today, if you have a brand which is famous, popular, it keeps changing the next week or the next month over there. So if you are not competent enough to maintain that, you lose your business in the field of advertising. So what is the entire essence of what I'm trying to reach out here is, how are the people changing preferences? ഇഷ്ടങ്ങൾ മാറുന്നു. എങ്ങനെ? മറ്റുള്ളവരെ കണ്ട്, മറ്റുള്ള ലൗകികമായ ഭൗമികമായ സുഖങ്ങൾ തേടി മാറുന്ന ലോകത്തിൽ അവിടെ കാണുന്ന കാരണങ്ങൾ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ കാര്യങ്ങൾ, how they are very much impressed over there, and that's where people are changing according to the desire of the world. In Egypt, when Abraham went into that space, he could only see the things of the world influencing him. He looked for food. He got it. He got camels. He got good sheep, oxen, donkeys, male and female servants to support the house. But at the cost of what? At the cost of his spiritual life. At the cost of his beloved's life. At the cost of his poor integrity. And may I remind you, and that's where the Lord could not tolerate. I keep saying this because യഹോവയ്ക്ക് അത് കണ്ട് സഹിക്കാൻ പറ്റാതെ വന്നപ്പോഴാണ് 17-ാം വാക്യത്തിൽ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്, the Lord struck the house of Pharaoh. The Lord struck the house of Pharaoh, and that's where we learn here, we as people, or we as even children of God, let me say, we cannot go contrary to the will of God. യഹോവയുടെ ഇഷ്ടത്തിന് എതിരായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ ഒരു സ്റ്റെപ്പ് എടുക്കാൻ തുടങ്ങിയാൽ അവിടെ നമ്മൾ പരാജിതനാവും. അവിടെ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്, the success we may able to reach, but there's a terrible price to pay for the areas where we make decision. And when the Pharaoh comes and asks, oh, Abraham, why did you do this? Why didn't you say? There we see with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. And what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? By that time we recognize Pharaoh recognized that she was Abraham's wife over there. We do not know the context, much detail, but eventually we can observe by saying Pharaoh might have encountered Sarai to ask, who are you really? And that's where the wife would have openly told, a truthful lady I would call it at the time, and there she might have blurted out, she is the wife of Abraham over there. And that's where we see Abraham is able to come back to God. Now, one thing which I see in this passage is, when we are living in a land of Egypt, the problem is not just the influence, but the longer we live in Egypt, the harder we find it to get back to God. നമ്മൾ എത്രമാത്രം മിസ്രൈം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു ഭൗമികമായ അട്രാക്ഷന് വേണ്ടി മാത്രം അവിടെ കടന്നു പോകുന്നു, അവിടെ ജീവിക്കുന്നു, അവിടെ നിന്ന് തിരിച്ചു വരാൻ നമ്മൾ എപ്പോഴും വൈകും ദൈവത്തിലേക്ക് തിരിച്ചു വരാൻ. അത് ദൈവം തീരുമാനിക്കുമ്പോൾ, when God decides, he will start with a strike over there. And that strike was to the house of Pharaoh. And when God struck the house of Pharaoh, there we understand it is where Abraham's life, it is not a means of over. അതവിടെ തീർന്നു പോയതല്ല, അവിടുന്ന് എബ്രഹാമിൻ്റെ തിരിച്ചു വരുവാണ്. ആ തിരിച്ചു വരുവാണ് how we see, even when Abraham was unfaithful, God was still faithful. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. God is faithful even when people like us are unfaithful. Now, I put myself into a picture where I look back at my goals and how did I function throughout 2025. As a minister of God, full-time minister of God, have I been obsessed only to minister? എൻ്റെ പ്രായോഗിക ജീവിതത്തിൽ എത്രമാത്രം ഞാൻ വചനം വായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്, എത്രമാത്രം എൻ്റെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ പ്രാർത്ഥനയുണ്ട്. ഞാൻ എന്നെ തന്നെ ചോദ്യം ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യമാണ്, തിരിഞ്ഞു പോയി നോക്കുമ്പോൾ, how much am I able to be with God? In 2025, how much I have spent time with God? How can I improve? How I compromised? How I stopped worshiping? Have some hindrances come because of me in my reach to God? If there are areas of hindrances, may the Lord help us to see. May the Lord give us grace to take steps forward. Coming back to the passage over here, there in verse 18, there we see Pharaoh calls Abraham and said, what is this you have done to me? When we turn to Matthew 5 verse 13 and 14, there we see the words of Jesus, you should be the light of the world, or you are the salt of the earth. ഒരു വിശ്വാസി ഒരു അന്ധകാരമുള്ള ഒരു ലോകത്ത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അന്ധകാരമുള്ള ഒരു സ്ഥലത്ത് ചെല്ലുമ്പം വെളിച്ചവും ഉപ്പുമാകേണ്ടടുത്ത് അവിടെ അബ്രാമിനെ പേടിയായിട്ട് എല്ലാവരും നോക്കുന്നത്. അബ്രാം അവിടെ ഒരു വെളിച്ചമല്ല, അവിടെ അവർക്കൊരു പ്രയാസമായി തീരുക. Now, because of us, or because of Abraham, let me say from this passage, how many people are getting affected? First of all, his wife, his own partner. Secondly, his own nephew. Thirdly, an entire nation over there. Now, sometimes you might say it is good for Egyptians to suffer. No, that's not the point over here. But we need to observe here, if God has called a believer to be a light of the world, how does a believer function as a light? Or as a believer, or as a Thomson, am I a pain to my brothers and sisters? If I am a pain to my brothers and sisters, I'm not a light of the world. I'm not a Christian over there. I'm not a person of the gospel. I am only a disgrace of the gospel. But if I, as a believer, if I can be helping people, a nation to grow, that is where I bring the kingdom principles into the lives of darkened world over there. And that's where Jesus Christ says to all of us, not only to preachers and evangelists, the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 to 20, go into the whole world. I have given you authority for teaching, preaching, discipling, and baptizing. Please remember, that is the roll call for every believer. If a believer cannot be functioning on these principles, may I remind you, we are not functioning properly. There is something breaking. We are broken over there. May the Lord help us to identify what are those areas. This passage reminds us from verse 17 onwards, the life of Abraham, it was not over. It was just the beginning over there. And that's where what Abraham thought was a short-sighted vision. I need to stop feeling hungry. He ended up making a bigger mistake. He was moving away from God. ഒരുപക്ഷെ അബ്രഹാം കനാനിൽ തന്നെ ജീവിക്കുമായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ, even in the time of famine, Eliyaവിന്റെ ദൈവം, where he was provided a meal over there, God would have definitely taken care of Abraham. But Abraham made a hasty decision, and in that hasty decision, he starts failing over there. May I remind you, the passage shows to us the justice of God, how we should not flee to Egypt, how we should not flee making an independent decision. And that's where the Lord is teaching us what is happening in the life of Egyptians. And as we come down to verse 20, Pharaoh commanded concerning him, they escorted away with his wife and all that belonged to him. Where we see Pharaoh in verse 19, now take your wife and go. Abraham is being asked to move out immediately. You have no right to stay back. We are called to be influenced. Now, I do not want to say this out much and louder, but just imagine when we establish ourselves, or when we are happy in a place, the government comes and says, you need to get out from here. How happy would be? Definitely, Abraham came with a great expectation to survive forward. Unfortunately, what happens in this man's life? He is not called to be in Egypt. He is called to be back in that land over there. Let's come down to chapter 13, a few verses, and there I would like to conclude over there. There, as I said earlier, when he came back from Egypt, from verse 1, I'm reading of chapter 13. So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife, all that belonged to him, and Lot is still with him. May I remind you that? He was very rich in livestock, in silver, gold, and he went on his journeys as far as from the Negev to Bethel, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning. Abraham തുടങ്ങിയ സ്ഥലത്ത് തന്നെ ദൈവം കൊണ്ടുവന്നിട്ടാണ് അവിടെ ഒരു ആരാധന തുടങ്ങുന്നത്. That place of worship was very important for, again, a beginning over there. Now, I'm not here to judge or criticize people, but may I remind everyone who is listening on Zoom, as well as people who are listening over here, if there are areas of problems we are facing today, that means there is a serious problem in our relationship, and that relationship with God, I see that in worship. Now, when I teach Sunday school for the kids there in Abu Dhabi, now ഒരിക്കലൊരു പയ്യനോട് ചോദിച്ചു, my dear, what do you learn in worship? And he just identified, the 2 hours we come on Sunday, that is worship. And I just said, what about the rest of the days of the week? That is not worship. That is where I get to enjoy. When he comes for worship, I'm coming after school, so it is late in the night. I get to sleep over there. Now, what I'm trying to bring the idea here is, how is worship a part of our daily life? ആരാധന ജീവിതം നമ്മുടെ ജീവിതത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രായോഗികമായി എല്ലാ ദിവസവും എങ്ങനെ ഇരിക്കുന്നത്? ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വെയർ അവർ ഇൻറ്റിമസി, അവർ റിലേഷൻഷിപ്പ് വിത്ത് ഗാഡ്. And if that relationship has got hindrance, that is where we are not able to move forward. And that's where God brings Abraham back to worship, back to Bethel, and there he restarts over there, verse 4, to the place where of the altar which Abraham made, he called on to the name of the Lord. And then later we understand the fall of Lot, a bad influence from Egypt. Verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes, and there he saw Sodom and Gomorrah, and there he was happy. Following chapters, but when we come to verse chapter 16, there we see Sarai and Hagar. Again, Abraham's faulty decision making even made doubting on his beloved later, how she made a bad choice. There we read in chapter 16, verse 2, now Sarai said to Abraham, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Now, how did Sarai understand it is only for Abraham? Because she has started assuming, അവളുടെ മനസ്സിൽ, സാറായുടെ മനസ്സിൽ കടന്നുപോയ ചിന്തകൾ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ അബ്രാമിന് മാത്രമാണ് ആ വാഗ്ദത്തം കൊടുത്തത്, അയ്യോ എനിക്ക് തന്നിട്ടില്ല. But when we come to chapter 12, there we see that promise is for Abraham and Sarai. ഗ്രഹനാഥനാ കൊടുത്തിരിക്കുന്നത്. ആ ഗ്രഹനാഥൻ്റെ പരാജയം കാരണമാണ് സാറായുടെ ജീവിതത്തിൽ പിന്നെ ഇമ്പൾസീവായിട്ട് അടുത്ത തീരുമാനം എടുക്കുന്നത്. ആൻഡ് ദാറ്റ് ഇമ്പൾസീവ് ഡിസിഷൻ Sarai started to regret later, and even today also we understand for the rest of the years of life how that decision making was very poor. So ഒരു കൈപ്പുള്ള ജീവിതത്തിൻ്റെ ആരംഭം ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ may we learn to look back to God. May we learn to take our choices firmly with God. And if there are areas of a problem in our relationship with God, shall we start restarting that worship? There was a famous quote by a writer. He says like this, what is worship? He emphasizes by saying, it is not just the service on Sunday. The worship begins the moment when we exit the walls of a church and re-enter back on a next Sunday over there. What a great way of showing to us how we define worship in our relationship with God in the every day of our life. And on Sunday, we get together to commemorate what we remember through Christ has doing through the rest of the days of the week. Especially on a Sunday, we honor the Lord's command. Shall we have these thoughts, prepare ourselves? നമുക്ക് ഈ ചിന്തകളാൽ തയ്യാറോടെ നമുക്ക് നാളെ ആരാധനയ്ക്ക് കടന്നു വരാം. May the Lord give us grace to move forward. Once again, I glorify and praise God for this time this evening. May His matchless name be glorified. God bless all of you.